So now that we've finished up the first part of the lecture and our overview of the course by discussing those discussion board requirements, we're going to move right along into part 2, which is where the really interesting stuff starts, because we're going to get into the specifics of the content for this class. So I mentioned that this class is going to introduce you to literature by making the argument that literature can help us grapple with the big questions we're all wondering in really productive ways. And I've chosen as the first question the concept of suffering. We all suffer. What do we do with that suffering? I think one concept that can help us work through that question is the concept of catharsis, which comes from the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. And so, in a sense, then, catharsis can be a concept that is helpful to us throughout the entire quarter, even as we move to different questions. And it's very helpful with this immediate question of suffering. But the question we have right now probably is, what is catharsis? We're going to use the article I gave you from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. We're going to work through that article together in this lesson 1, part 2, to understand what catharsis is and how it's helpful to the question at hand. But just immediately we have an illustration here of it in this image. So you have a man covered in some things, walking through fire. Those things have been removed when he gets to the other side of the fire. So catharsis is a process of purification by suffering. So trial by fire, but moreover purification by fire. Because that man, when he comes out the other side of those trials, those suffering represented by fire, he is a new creation, which is something wondrous. So that illustrates catharsis, but now we're going to talk about what it is. Before we dig deeper with catharsis, I want to do a little bit of course description. What is this course and why? So it's just broadly speaking, according to the university, meant to introduce you to literature, to the different genres of literature, fiction, poetry, and in the case of what we're studying in this first lesson, drama. Literature has long been a field of study at universities since the late 1800s. But we can't just do things on precedent, on tradition. I think we need to have a reason why. So why study literature? I argue that literature helps us grapple with the big questions. So please tell me that you've never at some point wondered, what do we do with our suffering? Does evil exist? Does God exist? What happens to us when we die? I think we've all wondered these things at some point. And they're not questions with easy answers, but they're questions, like I said, that are universal questions that everyone has wondered at some point. So they're not questions with clear-cut answers. And I'm not arguing that literature can give us clear-cut answers, but I'm arguing that literature can help us grapple, work through, struggle through, battle through these questions in more productive ways. I'm not saying I can answer why we suffer, but I can answer with some of the important things that happen when we suffer. And Oedipus shows us that through the concept of catharsis. And some of these other questions I mentioned above, along with 4 others, we will do this with different concepts and different pieces of literature. And that'll introduce us to fiction, poetry, and drama this quarter. But how? Through sympathetic identification with protagonists who struggle, suffer, and ask the big questions. Have you ever read something where you had this protagonist, this main character, you just connected with that character on so many levels, and you maybe you cried, but you felt what they were feeling, and at the end, you almost feel like you learned something. Great literature has the power to do that. And great literature asks the big questions. And so it can help us try to answer them as we are pulled into the struggles of these protagonists. So we learn more about ourselves as we make connections with these characters, as we learn more about Oedipus and the other characters we read. We're not just learning more about them, we're learning more about ourselves, which if you've had that experience I just described on the previous bullet point of being so consumed by a story that you felt, you suffered what that character felt and suffered, then you undoubtedly learned something very important at the end of that text. And it doesn't just then apply to that character, it also applies to you and me. So we're not going to shy away from the big questions in this class. Talking about suffering or evil or God or the afterlife, these are questions I think a lot of us shy away from because they're very controversial. There's very different views. And so I want to make very clear that I think we should not shy away from these questions. If there's any place in the world where people should discuss these questions, it's at the university. But if there's any place in the world where people should be able to discuss these questions respectfully and disagree and be respectful and loving to each other while we disagree, and maybe push each other, challenge each other to learn and grow by considering this person has a different perspective. What is their perspective and why? If there's any place in the world where that should happen in a respectful, loving, non-harmful way, that is the university. And so in this class, there are no wrong opinions. There are only opinions that are poorly explained or poorly defended. So you can make almost any argument you want in this class as long as you have evidence from the literature to back up what you say. And if you say something that really ticks someone off or something someone else says really ticks you off, respond in a loving, respectful way. I'll be reading your discussion board posts. And if I see people being unkind to each other, that'll be something I address. But I think we can disagree. We should disagree in very productive ways. And we need to get after these big questions. That's the point of studying literature. So it's challenging on many levels. One level is working with others as we do this. And ideally, hopefully, we can work in a very loving way together as we do this. So now with kind of the main, this is what the class is about covered, we're going to dive into the article. And we start with discussing the character of tragedy. And so a few things right off the bat first. Aristotle, who's really our source here, this is an article kind of explaining Aristotle's ideas. He was the very first philosopher to ever provide a theory of narrative. So when I say literature can answer the big questions, what I really mean is narrative can answer the big questions. There are some types of literature, for instance, lyric poetry, that doesn't have a narrative, but most literature has a narrative. And that's why people love literature. People love stories. So I argue seeing how stories playing out, seeing how narratives begin and end is a way to grapple with these questions. And so we need a theory of narrative to guide us. And Aristotle was the first, and people have built on what he said, but I still think being the foundational theorist of narrative, what he said still holds true today. And so Aristotle's theory of narrative is still the best theory of narrative to use. And one of his points is that art should imitate life. So like I said earlier, we can connect to those fictional characters. That's the good literature, the great books. Art should not be something very different from our own experience. It can be somewhat different, but in its fiction, it reveals great truths about our real world. And so art should imitate life. That's an idea that comes from Aristotle. Now, for Aristotle, two of the most important things were pity and fear. And you might be wondering why. Like, what are these emotions and why study these emotions? Why not study other emotions? As we go through this lecture, you'll see why pity and fear are so important. But one quote from the article that I think is really helpful to understanding the importance of pity and fear is this one. Tragedy seems always to involve testing or finding the limits of what is human. So, in other words, great literature is about understanding what it means to be human. And tragedies, for instance, like Oedipus, always push those boundaries. And seeing the tragic characters suffer, we learn more of what it means to be human. And pity and fear are two of the most central emotions to understanding what it means to be human. They're the powers which bring this human image to sight for us. Something important to consider is that tragedy does not evoke emotion just for the sake of evoking emotion. Remember the example from the article of like tear jerkers, things that just make us cry for the sake of making us cry. That's not the point here. Great tragedy writers like Sophocles are not just moving us to emotion for the sake of pouring out some emotions. They are trying to move us to something greater, something wondrous, which is catharsis. So let's try to pin down a definition of catharsis then. Operating from what we know already, tragedy is a deep swell of emotions, but those emotions move us to something greater. That something greater is catharsis. What is catharsis? In English, it means purgation, purging of something. But the word is translated from Greek, and the English version of the word just does not do justice to what the definition was in Greek. So in Greek, it means not just purgation, but also purification. So when that man in the illustration from the beginning of the lecture walked through the fire, he did not just get those elements purged from him. It wasn't just the bad stuff being taken away. He was purified as well. So he became, by going through the fire, he became, you could say, more of a new creation. So purgation is getting rid of something. Purification is getting rid of the worst parts of something so that you become something new. And in that sense, tragic catharsis gives way, leads to wonder. And I've got a couple of quotes here from the reading that I think just really sum this up well. So I'll try to parse them out for you in my own words to help us here. Sophocles, the author of Oedipus, is not training my feelings, but using them to show me something worthy of wonder. So I said on the last slide that the emotions in tragedy lead us to something. That something that our feelings lead us to is something worthy of wonder. Aristotle's use of the word catharsis is not a technical reference to purgation or purification, but a beautiful metaphor for the peculiar tragic pleasure, the feeling of being washed or cleansed. So if you read truly great tragedy, as we will in this class with Oedipus and then some other examples later on, there's a feeling you get at the end of tragedy, if it's truly great tragedy, that is really unparalleled. And when I say tragedy, I mean something very specific. So there are plenty of works that we might use the word tragic to describe, works that have a lot of suffering and death and hardship in them. But unless they evoke this specific feeling, this peculiar tragic pleasure, they are not tragedy. And that death, that destruction is useless and unnecessary. So when I ask you in this class to read hard or difficult texts, like Oedipus is arguably a very difficult and challenging text. So when I ask you to read Oedipus, I'm not asking you to read it because there's death and suffering. I'm not asking you to read about death and suffering just for the sake of death and suffering. I'm asking you to read it because there's a feeling you get at the end because it's true and good tragedy. And that feeling is unparalleled. And that feeling is a sense of wonder, such a powerful sense of wonder that it can only come through a very specific style of presentation of suffering and catharsis, which leads us to the wonder. So now that we've covered kind of the initial characteristics of tragedy, deep emotions that lead to catharsis, let's do like a very succinct overview here. 5 marks of tragedy. It imitates an action, so it imitates life. It arouses pity and fear, so we feel pity and fear as we read. It displays the human image as such, meaning as we are drawn into the protagonist and we experience pity and fear for them, we begin to understand what it means to be human better. We understand that better. It ends in wonder, so that suffering, that pity and fear lead to some realization that is absolutely wonderful. And then the work is inherently beautiful. That path of leading us to wonder is beautiful. But like I said, Now that we've got these marks lined out, why are pity and fear so important? We only have covered them briefly. We need to do more justice to them. Because if I were in your shoes at this point, and this were my first time reading this article, I still wouldn't get the pity and fear. I would just think that there would be other emotions that would be more important. But they really are the essential emotions. So let's look at why. What is pity? Today we think of pity as like, I feel sorry for that person. And it usually has this very negative connotation. But again, we're moving from the Greek to the English here. And just as catharsis means much more than purgation in Greek, pity means much more than just feeling sorry for someone. It's not just sentiment, it's empathy. So pity is seeing someone suffering and seeing how it is similar to our own suffering. The ability to recognize the parallels between our suffering and others' suffering. So it's truly a word that means empathy. But we use the word pity not just because that's what the Greeks used, but because it's not just empathy the way we think of it today. It's empathy specifically in the literary work. Empathy, a connection with the characters. And so there's something the literary work does to us that empathy can't do in other contexts. A good example of this is a quote from the literature. The pity that Shakespeare in his plays arouses in us shows what is precious in us in the act of its being violated in another. So he uses the example of King Lear, where a character is blinded. And when that character is blinded, we think about how much we appreciate our own eyesight. We come to appreciate it better, something we may take for granted because this character loses his eyesight. So that kind of literary empathy is what we mean when we say pity. So take this definition I just gave you and block out everything else you've ever thought about pity. You're getting to the true meaning here. Now moving on to fear. Pity is an interior kind of thing. It's an emotional, psychological connection to another being, in this case a literary character. Fear is more exterior. Fear is when something poses a threat to us, right? So in that sense, pity and fear are, you could say, two sides of the same coin. Another way of putting it, what we pity in others, we fear for ourselves. So when Gloucester loses his eyesight in King Lear, we pity him. We have empathy with him, for him. But we fear that we might lose our own eyesight. And maybe it's a fear we've always had. It's a fear I have from time to time. I think about all the things that are beautiful, looking out my window and seeing flowers bloom, seeing my children run through the yard. If I couldn't see that with my eyes, that would be tragic. So I have a fear of that. Seeing Gloucester experience it himself does something. It works with that fear in me, and it can move that fear to something more productive. And that's where catharsis comes into play. So the protagonist of tragedy makes such an impression on us that when a tragic figure is destroyed, it is a piece of ourselves that is lost. So Gloucester is a character we pity, and King Lear, we sympathize, we empathize with him. So when he is blinded or when he is destroyed, when he dies, we have such a connection to him, like a piece of us is also lost. Truly great writing with truly great characters should be able to pull you in a way that when that character is hurt or suffers or is destroyed, you experience, emotion alongside them, with them. I think Oedipus, as we'll see in the next part of the lecture, has that effect. He is a very appealing character. He's also frustrating at times, but we want to root for him. And for me, when I read Oedipus, when he is blinded, again, that theme of blindness at the end, I'm crying with him when I read it. And so I wouldn't be moved to that degree of emotion if it wasn't a piece of me that was being lost as well. And in great literature, not all literature can do that, but the great literature has the power to do that. How is this moving us to wonder and beauty? Well, we learn the worth of something by losing it. Maybe you've never really feared losing your eyesight, But when Gloucester loses his, or Oedipus loses his, you realize how valuable it is. And so perhaps the feeling of wonder is just realizing you've taken something for granted. That's very important. Maybe it's something else, but it's some kind of message, some kind of realization, a revelation, an epiphany that you can only get to by suffering alongside the characters of great tragedy. So we're going to look at two examples here to illustrate this point, and they're both from the article, but I have really loved these texts as I have worked my way through them over the years, and so I want to try to illuminate for you how the article was using these two pieces. Another great quote to kind of launch us here is, "What we find by being absorbed in the image of another is ourselves," right? So we have this pity, this empathetic connection to a character. So when we read great literature, we get absorbed in the image of another, in the image of a character, Gloucester or Oedipus or someone. And what we ultimately find in that image of another is ourselves, a reflection back. So through Gloucester or Oedipus losing their eyes, we learn something about ourselves. That's where the wonder and the beauty come into play. So let's take a look here. Wonder, and specifically the Iliad, is a man willing to risk his life, cross enemy lines, and kiss the hands of the man who killed his sons. That's a really amazing thing. If you've never read the Iliad, in the Iliad you have the war between the Greeks and the Trojans. And it's a 10-year-long war, and it's famous in Greek mythology, but in the actual text of the Iliad, it's just the last few months of the war. Not quite to the end, but 3 months or so from toward the end of the war in the 10th year. And it's mainly about the character development of the character Achilles. That's the primary focus of the Iliad. And at this point in the text, at the very end of the text, Achilles has killed Hector, who is the leader and best soldier for the Trojans, his enemies. Achilles is a Greek. And Priam is the king of the Trojans and the father of Hector. And Achilles is so angry at the Trojans because Hector killed Achilles' best friend Patroclus. He's so angry at them that he's abusing Hector's body. He's dragging it along behind his chariot. If you've ever seen the movie Troy, where Brad Pitt plays Achilles, it is terrible. It is so different from the literary work, but it does show this well. It does show, Brad Pitt as Achilles abusing Hector's body. And burial rites were very important to the ancient Greeks and the ancient Trojans. And so Priam wants his son's body so he can bury it properly. And it's so important to him to bury his son properly that he sneaks across to the Greek side so he could be easily killed. He's risking his life by crossing enemy lines. And yet he wants to appeal to Achilles to get his son's body back. So he actually kisses Achilles' hands. And the reason why our author picked this example to illustrate how suffering, pity, and fear lead to catharsis and eventually to beauty and wonder is because as the audience experiences those things, so does Achilles. What Priam does here, risking his life, kissing the hands that killed his son. Literally, Achilles slew Hector with these hands, and Priam kisses them. It's just amazing. It just blows Achilles' mind. No one has ever acted this way before in this culture, and so that's a moment of wonder. And it really gives Achilles pause and makes him think and reflect for the first time in a very long text. And Achilles' father is very important to him. So Priam starts appealing to Achilles as a father's son. And all of a sudden, this changes the dynamic. They have been hardened enemies, seeking vengeance against each other throughout the text. And what happens in this moment is Achilles no longer sees Priam as the enemy. He sees him as a father wanting to grieve and mourn his son. And Achilles says, hey, what would it be like? Or this is what he thinks in his head. I'm paraphrasing here. But what would it be like if I were dead and my father were mourning me? And all of a sudden, the dynamic shifts. They're no longer enemies, at least in this moment, in the same way. He then all of a sudden starts crying. There's actually a lot of crying by these very macho seeming men in the ancient epics. He starts crying, and he's mourning with Priam because he's feeling pity. He's feeling empathy. He's empathizing with Priam's pain. And so all of a sudden, it's like in that moment, he becomes Priam's son. But if he becomes Priam's son through pity, then he's also becoming Hector's brother, if he's Priam's son. So that's an even bigger step, because they fought and killed each other on the battlefield. And so Achilles sees something wondrous, Priam crossing the lines and kissing his hands, but it moves Achilles to something even more wonderful, which is enemies, at least for a moment, becoming brothers. And you feel fear too, because he says to Priam at one point, "You better get out of here before I get angry," as they're grieving together and having this beautiful moment, because he doesn't want to lose this new feeling. He is, for a character who, for 23 of 24 books of the Iliad, has been the most selfish, prideful, arrogant, self-focused, narcissistic character in all of literature, is in this moment feeling empathy for others. He doesn't want to lose that feeling. It's something wondrous, something beautiful. So both pity and fear are at work here. Achilles feels pity for his own father, which enables him to feel pity for Priam. Through shared grief, i.e., suffering, Achilles becomes Priam's son and subsequently Hector's brother. So that's something very wonderful, as I've explained, but we can't get there without pity, without fear. And catharsis is the purification of Achilles. It's his realization in this moment, and it's our purification, our simultaneous realization as the audience. So let's see, we did the 5 marks of tragedy before. Let's see how they specifically show up in the Iliad. So you have action. At the beginning of the text, Achilles holds himself out of the war, incredibly selfish, and at the end, he returns Hector's body. So self-sacrificial, giving up his right to vengeance, because he now empathizes with Priam. And so you have 2 specific actions that bookend the text, and they illustrate the character growth of Achilles. So you have art imitating life, pity and fear. We pity Achilles and Priam for they've lost their friends or their children, so we empathize with them. And then Achilles has become a better human, but he's afraid of losing that new one humanity, so we experience both pity and fear. What's the human image here? Priam's willingness to cross the line, that's the limit of the human image. Remember, tragedy tests the limits of the human image. But Achilles also has this new one empathy, this newfound humanity. We also see the best of what humans can become, despite our wicked inner nature in that moment. What is the wonder? In Achilles' capacity to be moved by the wonder of a suffering fellow human, we wonder at him. So that new one empathy is the wonder and the beauty. At the end of the Iliad, as at the end of every tragedy, we are washed in the beauty of the human image, which are pity and fear brought to side. So after 23 books of vengeance and suffering, etc., we see, Achilles' new one empathy, even if it's just in a moment, and that's a beautiful sight. Now, much of what I've talked about with the Iliad here as an example of how catharsis leads to wonder is to do with suffering, as tragedy often does, as we see in Oedipus, as we'll look at in more detail in Oedipus in just a minute. And so I'm going to show a quote from the Bible with you. I know the Bible can be a very controversial text, but it has, regardless of what you think of the Bible, I don't think anyone refutes that there are plenty of passages in the Bible with great wisdom. And I always try to give multiple angles on a subject. So I understand what I'm saying here about catharsis leading to wonder might be a bit confusing. So I want to just come at it from a different angle. And if you're familiar with this Bible passage, I think it says the same thing in a different way, which is from Romans chapter 5, verses 3 to 4. Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. So you have a sequence of things here, just like you have a sequence of suffering leads to pity and fear, leads to catharsis, which leads to wonder and beauty. So it's a similar idea. And I said at the beginning, why study tragedy? There's so much suffering. If it's a specifically, truly tragic work and the beautiful kind of tragedy, then we can actually rejoice in our sufferings, because Achilles endures suffering, but it produces character. He becomes empathetic, and that produces hope. If Achilles, of all people, can become empathetic, that should give us great hope, because he is incredibly prideful before that. He is like that man walking through the fire. He is a new creation at the end of the text. So I always end with a couple of questions that are then the questions you can pursue on the discussion board, and I call those learning questions, because this is where we take the thoughts a step further. So I've just given an overview of catharsis, and in a way it's a theme for our class. So do you agree or disagree, and why? You may disagree. You may say, this is ridiculous. I don't want to read a bunch of text with people dying and suffering. And I think that's a very valid point, but I'd love to hear the reasons why. Also, if you agree, I'd love to hear the reasons why. But I always like to give you options, so you could also choose this one. I called this lecture, I mentioned the pursuit of catharsis in this portion of the lecture. So it's something we can pursue, something we can find. The definition of tragedy is both specific and general. Specific in the sense of you can't just have suffering for suffering's sake, as I mentioned earlier. It has to achieve this wondrous effect that is possible through tragedy. So it's very specific, but it's general in that the ancient Greek texts, the Iliad, Oedipus, are not the only texts where we can find this specific kind of tragedy. I would argue you can find it almost anywhere. And so the other question you could choose to answer instead is, what are some other places where you see it? What other places do you see characters suffer? Like a book you've read, a play you've seen, a movie you've watched, a show you've watched, a video game you've played. What is another text where you've seen a character suffer, empathized with that character, feared the same things they fear, but that pity and that fear moved you to some kind of beautiful, wondrous realization?